It's really quite ambitious, and there does also appear to be the follow-through that we're seeing. So it's a completely new ballgame for internal trade.
One of the biggest challenges facing the Canadian economy is kind of improving what we already do. Better efficiency, more open trade, what the feds have been calling one Canadian economy. How do we get there? Well, getting there is important. The value is estimated as $200 billion in lost GDP. Trevor Tombe is one of Canada's most sought-after economists when it comes to explaining big trends. He is also a go-to expert on this issue, internal trade barriers. He's crunched the numbers, a lot of them, on provincial trade, and he's looked at what happens if those barriers are removed. Spoiler alert, really good things happen. He also recently published a report for PPF looking specifically at the Atlantic region where killing trade barriers has a big impact. He happens to be a PPF Fellow. Trevor, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
I want to start big picture with this subject because I'm going to be honest, from the very first time it was raised recently, because we've been talking about this for 30 years, I was skeptical. And I was skeptical to the point of eye rolling about the ability to suddenly do something that we haven't been willing to do. Not because we couldn't do it, of course, but because we haven't been willing to do it. So I did want to start with whether you see a shift in that. Does it feel like it's different this time?
I do think there's been a shift. We've seen announcements by many provinces now about significant moves that really would move the needle here on internal trade costs. And before I describe what provinces are doing, it's worth remembering what internal trade barriers are. They're not tariffs like we see between countries, and often they're not even explicit barriers to trade. It's just that the rules differ from one province to the next for health and safety, for different product standards, for professional credentials. So regulations being different means that it's more costly for a business to operate across provincial boundaries because now they have to simultaneously comply with multiple sets of regulations, and sometimes it makes it more costly to buy and sell. Maybe you need to have your item inspected multiple times. Maybe you need to design it a little bit differently, or if you're a service provider as an individual, go through some hoops to be registered appropriately in another jurisdiction. So that's what internal trade frictions really are. And historically, provinces have opted to try and harmonize with each other, try and align what their rules are to ease those burdens, but that's really, really slow. And so what we've seen starting with Nova Scotia earlier this year are commitments to, instead of harmonize, recognize the rules of another jurisdiction as valid in their own. So you can imagine a product safe for sale in Ontario can be brought into Nova Scotia without any additional checks, and even if it is not technically compliant with the local regulation. And that started by Nova Scotia, but we've seen many, many provinces now adopting similar arrangements and making similar deals. Ontario with New Brunswick, Ontario with Manitoba. Just this morning, an announcement from Alberta and Nova Scotia, not just about pursuing that, but effective immediately. Now, between Alberta and Nova Scotia, goods and services that are compliant with one jurisdiction are good to go in the other. And to see that movement, that really is the best policy lever to pull to ease what these trade barriers are. Even last week, Quebec announcing that they will be passing legislation very similar to what Nova Scotia brought out back in February of this year. So it's really quite ambitious, and there does also appear to be the follow-through that we're seeing. So it's a completely new ballgame for internal trade.
Which is definitely, I guess, grounds for optimism that we keep moving forward, because a lot of this is, to your point, it's some of them are broad strokes like that. Recognition is a kind of a thematic thing you can change, but there will be sort of brass tacks around, what does it mean for different regulatory bodies, for different professional associations. I want to level back up to the numbers that get tossed around, enormous numbers of what we're leaving on the table, and ask you, because you're somebody who actually does the work to figure this stuff out, are they genuine? Can we really say there's $200 billion in excess, economic activity that we're missing here?
Well, we can certainly say that there's research suggesting that there's 200 billion in economic activity on the table here, and that actually comes from a paper that I co-authored with Ryan Minucha, published through the Macdonald-Laurier Institute back in 2022, where we were analyzing some of the gains from these kind of mutual recognition, broad-based across the board. Now, keep in mind, Canada's economy is a little over $3.1 trillion right now. And so what we're really talking about are productivity gains potentially as high, we estimate, of 8%. And an 8% productivity gain, some additional context here, that's about 1/5 of the total gap between us and the United States. So I'd say that it's a credible number, but just full transparency, it is the higher end of a range of estimates that we put out. It could be on the lower end about half that amount, but even productivity gains of a little over 4%, that's still quite considerable, roughly 100 billion or so in gains per year. So having gains from trade, that's not new. We see that across countries. We've experienced it with free trade with the United States. We know those benefits are large. That's why we're as concerned as we are as Canadians about the prospect of trade frictions between us and the United States returning. But those same gains can, over the long term, be found by liberalizing trade within the country as well.
That is a really important addition, and it's why we love you. Over the long term, the time frame of when we see the benefits of these changes is important. And of course, It could take, we don't know. That's the thing. We don't, when you liberate businesses and individuals from rules, you don't know whether they act on that change immediately or whether it takes decades. What's your kind of best assumption about when we do see the return on this?
I think the right time frame that we should have in mind for the full gains to materialize is on the order of decades. Now, much of that can be achieved on the order of years, but we're not talking about, mutual recognition agreements being signed and now suddenly growth doubles, triples, and so on for years on end. What we're talking about over the short term is potentially increases in growth rates on the order of 0.1 to 0.2%, roughly. Now, it is hard to estimate this because, of course, it depends on a lot of things that are really difficult to model. Like, in particular, how do businesses respond to the new regulatory environment? So Alberta and Nova Scotia, I'll use that only because it was announced just this morning, and we're recording here on June 4th, that effective immediately, the rules of one jurisdiction for goods and services are good to go in the other jurisdiction. It'll take some time for businesses to find buyers, make those connections, learn about the markets, scale up what they produce, and the competition will now then gradually increase between businesses, and that will lead some to grow larger while others shrink, and that's a process that can take some time. So it's not a substitute for trade disruption with the United States. That's short-term costs, very highly disruptive. But long-term, how long it is, definitely years, potentially decades.
Let's talk about the Merit Atlantic provinces and the kind of implications for that region. Why is it different there than it is between, say, the Prairie provinces? Or is there something different about kind of the way they relate to one another that makes this even more economically advantageous?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why internal trade liberalization is more valuable for Atlantic Canada than elsewhere, but the simplest reason is just that internal trade is a much larger share of their economies. Interprovincial imports, for example, are about 1/3 of GDP in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, or over 40% for Prince Edward Island, whereas for British Columbia or Alberta, it's about 20%, and down as low as about 13% for Ontario. So if you can ease the cost of doing business across provincial boundaries, it just matters more for economies that engage in a lot more internal trade. And Saskatchewan and Manitoba to a lesser extent as well. So it's the smaller economies that stand to gain the most from liberalization. And that's why in the paper released with the PPF takes a harder look at Atlantic Canada in particular, thinking about what the gains are for those provinces.
And therefore, I guess that helps make the case for doing it. One thing that jumped out at me, it was now a couple of weeks ago, but as we begin to have this conversation about, because a lot of these barriers do have to do with professional accreditation, the movement of people with who are looking for work, and the social workers of Nova Scotia put their hands up and said, we accreditate differently than Alberta, and that's a problem. How easy is it to solve those things?
So we have to distinguish between rules that are different between jurisdictions for a reason, for a clear reason, versus rules that exist between jurisdictions to try and, for lack of a better word, engage in protectionism to limit the amount of competition that local suppliers of a particular service might face. And so we're going to have, and there's roughly 600 or so of these provincial regulatory bodies that govern professions and the credentials at play here. There's going to be some tension here between those that are kind of worried about what the increased competition might mean for their members versus those that are raising potentially legitimate issues. And so I mentioned Quebec, for example. You have a fundamentally different legal system based not on common law, but on civil. And so one could, I think, pretty easily make the case that for legal services, you might need a different system to accredit that particular profession. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. And so it's going to be hard for governments to try and distinguish legitimate areas where rules should differ from where most regulations lie, just differences that slow down the amount of competition that local suppliers face. Now, what we saw with Alberta and Nova Scotia is when it comes to professional credentials, not a complete deference to another jurisdiction, but there will be a 10-day time limit to review, and this will basically just be a check about whether someone is in good standing elsewhere and holds appropriate insurance. And so that seems like a reasonable thing to check, that someone's not just hopping to another province after violating all of the rules that existed in another. But these are very minimal expectations, proper insurance and be in good standing. And so I guess we'll see how things unfold, but I'm encouraged that governments are much more willing now to put a lot more weight on the broader economic implications of liberalization. And if there are things that need to be adjusted later on because we learn about some adverse potential consequences, then we can circle back and make adjustments then.
One of the impediments to this kind of change, of course, is the muscle memory of the provinces and how they've been behaving. To me, some of it showed up even in the most recent budget in Ontario, where there are some changes that favor investment in Ontario, which is what you would expect. We've come to expect that from provincial governments. Of course, they want to attract investment. In this context, that looks different to me. It looks like it's anti-free internal trade. It looks like it might actually stick in the craw of one of the other premiers, and they might say, "Hey, Doug Ford, that's not the spirit of what we're up to here." How much of that will keep going on and be sort of the human impediment to this whole thing?
Well, you're absolutely right to note that that is something that can be thought of as a barrier to internal trade. There are not just costs of entering a market, but any kind of artificial incentive to enter a market is really just the mirror image of it, and just as distorting. And we see this very regularly in, for example, film, where jurisdictions are competing against each other for a particular industry. And often that doesn't work out too well economically for even the provinces involved. Certainly the government's bottom line here when they're laying out those financial incentives. And it's something that it's difficult to avoid, but we're almost surely going to continue to see some of this. And even the ambitious announcements that we're seeing now, these are not complete liberalizations here where it's no exceptions, wide open. But it's still a big move relative to the way things have been operating. So I guess this should change the way we think about the potential gains. That 200 was the higher end of a hypothetical removal of every single barrier, no matter what the underlying cause was. We should think about something that's a fraction of that as actually achievable, given the politics that naturally creeps in in some industries. And investment attraction incentives is one of those policy areas.
And of course, one place where policy and politics collide in this country is around supply management. And I've seen a suggestion that it will soon become a kind of an issue around trade liberalization internally. I'm not entirely clear on where it shows up. You may have some insight on that. But for sure, you can see that anybody who's outside the system would see it as an irritant. And that includes all of our major trading partners in the world. Do you think that will become a sort of a pivotal point?
Well, supply management is a uniquely salient political issue. And so whether we make progress on that is really difficult to predict. Certainly not something I would hazard a guess at, because it will come down to some political risk calculations that governments make. But it is an internal trade barrier in the sense that what supply management is that you have quotas for production of certain commodities, dairy being a big one. And those quotas are province specific. So, and I haven't checked, I guess, the prices of these quotas, but roughly speaking, for the amount produced by your typical dairy cow in Alberta, that license is about $50,000, whereas in Ontario and Quebec, I believe it's something closer to $25,000, roughly speaking. And so there are these big differences in the value of those quotas, which is evidence that there could be gains from expanding the scale of dairy producers in one part of the country to serve a market in another. And so to the extent that that's currently not something that can easily be done, we should think about supply management as an internal trade friction, although it's also connected directly to conversations and negotiations with the United States. And in terms of something that we can use as a concession in those negotiations, it may be worth waiting for those discussions to proceed before putting it front and center on the internal side.
It is kind of, I guess, emblematic of what makes this so interesting, that we're internally finally doing things we should have done. And I say that in the context of Canada is a nation that understands the benefit of trade and has benefited from freer trade with our largest partners. And so we've become kind of believers, maybe even overly believers in the endless benefits of free trade. At the very time where we're turning that lens inward, as we should, and we all can understand why that makes sense, the world is moving in a protectionist direction. I mean, we are rethinking all of our trading partners, and that includes our most liberal, and it included the Biden administration. So this isn't a President Trump thing, as everybody knows. We're in a new, more protectionist era where there's, I guess, an understanding, Trevor, of the limits of the benefits. That free trade is good, but it's not endlessly good. You can't just let it keep going forever and assume that it will continue to improve. There's a bit of a weird tension there, that we're liberalizing, but we're also protecting. And we're going to protect at the border, too, like everybody else. We're going to have this new weird Buy Canada mentality, which is anti-free trade. How do we square those things?
So I think there's a couple of takeaways there from that. First is you're right, and I share that observation that the world does seem to be moving in a more protectionist direction, and not uniquely U.S. phenomenon either. Brexit in part is tied into that as well. But the defining feature of international trade right now is potentially just around uncertainty, what policy is and what it will be. And internal trade is something where we as Canadians, through our provincial, territorial, and federal governments, control the nature of internal trade directly. And so to the extent that there's an uncertainty challenge abroad, then naturally you want to focus on things that you can control. And we can't control the international environment. But I think the more important lesson from the international experience is that international trade does increase productivity and growth and investment levels and so on. But there are winners and losers. And the average can increase, and indeed the standard of living of most people can increase, but some businesses, and therefore some workers, will shrink and some shut down in response to trade liberalization, because the source of gains is that productive firms grow larger, serving a now larger market, and That means the unproductive firms are going to shrink and shut down. And that same dynamic would exist within Canada. And part of the challenge, especially in the United States, is that when those import competing lower productivity firms also happen to be regionally concentrated, then you have developments like what we see in the Rust Belt. It is called that for a reason. Manufacturing contraction there has been an issue where many people living there feel left behind from what is an advancing economy that they see elsewhere. So ensuring that we pair liberalization with attention to sectors or regions that might be adversely affected is important.
It's a slight shift in topic, but it's highly related to improving our internal trade in Canada. And that is, of course, improving our productivity. And I think we can assume that one will lead to the other in the sense that the forces of competition have this kind of winnowing effect that you're talking about. It's not something I think politicians like to headline, that, we'll reduce these regulatory barriers. And it means, suddenly an Alberta company is competing head on with a Nova Scotia one, and it'll make both of them better. But one of them might actually fail. It does have a winnowing effect. It's been observed in this country, Trevor, that we have a host of companies that survive past their natural end date, the zombie companies that they carry debt, they don't have the cash flow to sustain their operations in a kind of a typical way, but they kind of continue to thump along in Canada because good enough is good enough, and there's not real competition to force them out. Is there kind of a reality that we won't see politicians trumpet, that what we're talking about here are competition forces that will make businesses go bankrupt? Some people will lose their jobs, and that will be good for the economy.
Yes, no question. There will be firms that go bankrupt if we increase internal trade liberalization, but there will be other firms that grow larger and become more prosperous and serve a larger market and increase their employment. And so it's a process of reallocating where the jobs are rather than reducing the total number of jobs that exist. Now, that adjustment is difficult, certainly, for individuals involved, so I don't want to belittle that, but it's not the bankruptcy or the reduction in size that's occurring in a vacuum. Those firms are shrinking because another firm in Canada is growing, eating their lunch, if you will. They're a higher productivity or higher quality, or they do something that consumers value more than the other firm. And so in a sense, we would like Canadians that discover, innovative ways of producing a company, we'd like them to succeed. And naturally, that does mean that someone else is not. That's the nature of competition, and ultimately is the reason for the prosperity that we have enjoyed and have seen increase over the past many decades. And so for governments, of course, there's challenges in managing that, but we should think of the role of government here not as trying to prevent the competition itself and the creative destruction that occurs in that process, but in a targeted way, helping facilitate the adjustment, through education and training, especially for younger workers, that's quite relevant. Maybe even targeted kind of income support for a certain period of time for displaced workers. And we do see that as a feature sometimes during recessions where the EI system becomes more generous in certain regions compared to others. So it's supporting individuals rather than trying to prevent the market processes from, through profit and losses, finding who is the best producer of a particular good or service.
And I mean, I think to your point of the kinds of supports we might need to put in place, we might agree that in this process of sort of the most efficient producers expanding and the least efficient producers contracting, those efficient producers will need fewer people. This is just the way that the world is going. I will expand my business likely with automation and AI and robotics and anything else I can do, and it's not going to be a one-for-one transfer of a human job if I'm Maybe you're shaking your head. Maybe you don't agree. But it seems to me that we're this kind of nirvana that we're picturing around internal trade in Canada. It is one with fewer jobs, better economic output, but not the same, which is sort of this weird conundrum of Donald Trump wanting to bring back the Rust Belt jobs. Of course, they're not there anymore. They don't exist anymore inside steel firms. And so I guess my question is, are we also pursuing something for all the right reasons, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but that we should be realistic about?
So there's two issues here. First, on trade. I don't think it would be right to think about trade as a process that shrinks the number of jobs. What trade does is change which jobs the economy has relatively more of compared to another. So it's a change in the type of jobs. Now, we've seen that. Just think about the experience of the Canadian economy and free trade with the United States over the past 40 years or so. It is not the case that Canada has seen a reduction in its employment rate as a result of free trade with the United States, but some industries have grown, other industries have shrunk, certain firms have increased relative to others within particular sectors, so the jobs change. And the second point around technology potentially changing the demand for labor in certain sectors, that's a really interesting issue because on the one hand, new technology makes labor more productive. And so more value for each hour worked. And typically, labor productivity increasing results in higher incomes and higher purchasing power of those incomes. And for any given firm that might demand fewer workers than it would have otherwise, the wages that it pays will be much larger. Now, where do the jobs then materialize elsewhere in the economy? That's tough to say, but historically, we have seen periods of incredible technological development with jobs shrinking in some sectors dramatically, but expanding elsewhere. Just think about agriculture, where a majority of employment was in Canada a few generations ago, and now it's something on the order of a couple percent of total employment. So where the jobs in the future will be, that's hard for anyone to know. That's why entrepreneurs are rewarded when they take bets on expanding activity in certain areas. And it'll be a process where we kind of discover, over time where those jobs shift into. But technological change, yep, that's also something like trade that creates these adjustments and these shifts.
If you had to, and I'm sure you've given this plenty of thought because it's been a subject that's bedeviled Canada's economy for a couple of generations now. But if you had to sort of say, this is the policy to start with when it comes to improving our productivity, broad brush, is it internal trade? You might have said free trade externally at some point, but would you say now this is actually the thing? This is it?
I do strongly think internal trade is the most important policy lever for governments to start to move the needle on productivity growth, which has been a challenge for many years. And I say that because unlike infrastructure, where I also think there's some very important things that need to change there, internal trade liberalization can be done quickly, because it is simply about deciding that the rules of one jurisdiction will be good enough for compliance with your own. We saw that with Nova Scotia and Alberta today, and it's still, I need to think twice, like, am I misquoting the news release here? No, I've read it multiple times, like effective immediately for goods and services between these two provinces. Compliance with one jurisdiction's rules is good enough for sale of that item in another. And that was just a decision that the governments took. The gains will take time, but this is a policy change that, unlike building a new rail line or interprovincial transmission line or pipeline or road, where it physically takes a long time to do, internal trade liberalization, it's just about making the decision.
Is there is that a model that could be replicated immediately across the country? In other words, those two provinces have gone to the trouble of working that out. Could that same decision be made just as simply by the rest of them?
No question about it. And we have had commitments through these memorandums of understanding between various other pairs of provinces. New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador, Ontario and Manitoba come to mind as recent examples. And so we'll see how quickly these other jurisdictions move. But if I'm not mistaken, it's Alberta and Nova Scotia that was the first to make it effective rather than just this commitment. But many other provinces have committed to doing just this very thing. And so the follow through is what we're waiting for.
And on that, where do you see the biggest weak spots? Is it professional associations that have rights of their own that could throw a wrench into all of this? Where do you see us stumbling here?
Indeed. So most internal trade is in services. About 60% of all that we trade between provinces is services trade. That makes it very different than international trade, where Canada-US, it's about 20% of our total trade is in services. And the barriers in services are largely around the credentials that govern the service providers, the engineering firms, and so on, professional services, financial, legal, advisory services, and so on. And those professional bodies are, naturally hesitant to move in a big way. And so that's the biggest source of pressure on provincial governments. And I suspect that no government will be willing to just simply say, a credential is 100% portable, no questions asked, automatically. What we'll see is that the burden that regulatory bodies can place on someone who applies to receive a credential in another province, we'll see time limits on how long that takes, and we'll see the bar really lowered on what those individuals need to have. And I hate to bring up the Nova Scotia-Alberta thing so frequently, but it's now a really good model. The requirements there are that you're in good standing in the other province, so there's a check on that. It's sensible, and that you have appropriate liability insurance, and that's it. So no additional examinations, no exorbitant fees, no long delays, and so it's lowering the cost on getting credentialed in other provinces significantly.
One thing the federal government has promised is to remove federal internal trade barriers by July 1st. And when they said it, I thought, well, that should be easy. What are the federal internal trade barriers? But apparently there are some. What kind of barriers do they have control of?
Well, most, and it's good to be clear about this up front, most of the interprovincial frictions are from provinces, simply because provinces are, for the most part, responsible for most areas of economic activity and the regulations that govern them. But there are areas that are federal in jurisdiction. I think about two areas in particular that are very important. Agricultural inspections. There can often be, through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, checks on items that cross provincial boundaries, even if they've been inspected by the provincial inspection bodies. So you might see some changes there in terms of federal inspections deferring to the provincial inspections rather than doing it multiple times. There's also federal regulations on trucking that affect interprovincial shipments. And trucking services are very important because basically all that we're trading between each other in terms of physical goods goes by either rail or trucks. And in terms of the value, about 3/4 of it is trucks. And so if there's ways for the federal government to defer to provincial trucking regulations, well, then that lowers the costs on those firms, potentially then making that sector more productive, and that cascades through to any sector that purchases trucking services. So those are two areas to think about, and there are others. But yeah, for the most part, internal trade frictions are provincial.
We do have, of course, still an uncertain trade relationship with the U.S. I think there's a lot of hope that we get to some kind of resolution. I don't know whether you'll share my view that that resolution will include a higher tariff level than we've enjoyed in the recent past. There will be some kind of tariff barrier between us and the States, but anyway, that's just my dire view on things. I don't think it'll be very high, but I think there'll be something, 5-10%. Do you believe, whatever that new relationship looks like, we'll be able to offset the economic drag of what's happening with real action in real time? We talked about the fact that, the $200 billion is the high watermark, and that could take a decade. But in the meantime, can we actually make enough change that, say, in second quarter and third quarter this year, we could actually create some benefit internally to help offset the suffering we're doing?
So it does depend on the size of the tariff. And so if you could imagine a 1% tariff, just throwing that number out there. That's not something that would create a recession in Canada, but a 25% tariff would. So where we land is very important, and the last several months has taught me to not try and predict what the U.S. federal government is going to do with respect to trade policy. But if we have a full-blown trade war at 25% as the rate that's being applied, then there's been a lot of analysis put out from myself with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the major financial institutions, the Bank of Canada most recently with analysis on what it might mean. And estimates vary. But it basically shrinks our economy by between 2.5% to 4% or so. That's kind of the range of estimates that people are arriving at. So it would be a recession this year. But over the long haul, even if those tariffs remain in place permanently between us and the United States, it would be about a 2-year process of adjustment for the Canadian economy, and then we return to trend growth with a smaller economy than we otherwise would have had, but it's that 2.5% to 4% smaller. Over time, though, with internal trade liberalization, the low end of the estimates from the paper I noted that myself and Ryan Minucha put together with MLI was a little over 4%. So over the long term, the gains from internal liberalization are larger than the losses from a 25% trade war between us and the United States. So in principle, we can compensate, but there's no avoiding the short-term costs. There's not much that the government could do in a full trade war to prevent a recession this year.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, Trevor. It's so good to have you for this. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Happy to join.
We've been talking with Trevor Tombe. Before you go, here are 3 things we think are worth watching this week. A meeting between the premiers and the prime minister this week ended with high fives all around, but no real detail on what major projects will get the nod. There are some pretty major devils in the details here. We're standing by before we get too excited. But for now, everyone in the class gets a gold star for a good attitude. The Bank of Canada did its best to stay positive this week. It did hold its key lending rate at 2.75% and said the degree of uncertainty means it's best to keep its powder dry. Just about everyone thinks that this summer quarter will be a weak one as the effects of tariffs and also the hangover of all that activity that happened at the start of the year to get ahead of them shows up in our economy. Look for rate cuts later this year, unless, of course, inflation keeps rising. You wonder if the bank looks longingly back at the time when it only had a pandemic to fight. And finally, just when everyone had agreed not to mention the climate, wildfires in the prairies are making that hard. It's the kind of extreme climate-related event that taxes insurance companies and traumatizes people fleeing from their homes. Coming the same week Canada's promising to become an energy superpower, we're not saying you can't be both a big energy power and fight climate change. We're just saying that's not easy and probably warrants some conversation. That's WONK for this week. I'm Amanda Lang.